I spent years building my farm the way I'd always dreamed of, a piece of land inherited from my family, where every fence, every plantation, and every shed had a piece of my sweat. But while I was away sorting out personal issues, the HOA decided that my property was not up to community standards. And their solution? Burn it down. Yes, they set fire to my barn. Destroyed everything I had built. What they forgot is that I'm not just any farmer. I'm a veteran, and now this war is personal. Do they think they'll get away with it? Just wait until I start my revenge. When I, Mason Cooper, returned home, the smell of smoke still permeated the air, mixed with the smell of burnt wood and overturned earth. My heart started pounding even before I saw the scene in its entirety. It was one of those moments when you feel that something has gone very wrong before you even have proof. But when I turned down the dirt road that led to my farm, I didn't need any more proof. The barn, it was a pile of ashes and smoking rubble. The wire fence I'd installed myself, twisted as if it had been through a war. And the main house, although still standing, had dark soot marks running up the walls like scars left by an unjust battle. And it was at that moment that the realization hit. Someone had set fire to my farm. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a storm. The fire was deliberate. My lungs filled with rage. And my mind, still trained after years in Army Special Forces, began to process the situation with frightening clarity. I looked around and noticed that some plaques had been driven into the ground. New, shiny plaques, practically screaming arrogance. I walked over to one of them, my boots sinking into the still warm earth, and read the words that made me want to punch something. Repossessed property, Fairview Homeowners Association. The HOA. The fucking HOA. The same entity that had been sending me letters every week about ridiculous infractions. High grass. Misaligned fence, worn out shed. As if the farm was a suburban backyard and not a rural property that was here before this damn association even existed. I closed my eyes for a second, taking a deep breath. My grandfather always said that when something went wrong, counting to 10 would help, but I was already on 37 and my anger was only growing. Mason, is that you? I turned at the sound of a familiar voice, and there was Dr. Rachel Santos, walking across my property with a look of concern on her face. Rachel was a local veterinarian who'd helped me with my livestock for years. She was also on the town council and had been one of the few voices opposing the HOA's growing power in our rural community. I came as soon as I heard, she said, her dark eyes taking in the destruction around us. They're saying it was an electrical fire, but we both know that's bullshit. That's when I heard the sound of an approaching engine, a gleaming white pickup truck, the kind that only someone who had never got their hands dirty would drive. It stopped abruptly, and the door opened with that sound of cheap authority. And who got out? Victoria Harrington, the president of the HOA, with her sunglasses that cost more than a week's hard work and a smug smile. She got out of the car, as if she were arriving at a business meeting rather than a crime scene. I see you've arrived, she said, straightening her jacket. Rachel stepped closer to me, her body language protective. Victoria, what the hell happened here? I looked around, then at Victoria. My hands itched to do something far less civilized than reply, but I stopped myself. Tell me you didn't do it, I said, my voice dangerously low. She made a noise with her mouth, an irritatingly rehearsed, not really sound, before crossing her arms. Your property was in serious violation of HOA regulations. The barn was a fire hazard, your fence wasn't up to community standard, and that old structure? Well, frankly, it didn't fit with the aesthetic we're trying to maintain around here. The aesthetic. The fucking aesthetic. I felt my blood boil. Years of military service had taught me to maintain control. But that was an insult. She continued talking as if she were explaining to a child why they can't have sweets before dinner. So we took action for the sake of the community's safety. The HOA took legal possession of the land, and we scheduled the demolition. The fire was a small, unforeseen. She said it as if I should say thank you, as if they were doing me a favor by destroying everything I had. I laughed. Not a happy laugh, not a nervous laugh. A dry, incredulous laugh. Because this woman had no idea who she was dealing with. If she thought she could set fire to my farm, put up a pretty sign, and carry on with her life as if nothing had happened, then she was about to learn a very expensive lesson. Because if there's one thing the Army has taught me, it's that when someone touches what's yours, you take it back. And I wasn't just going to get my farm back. I was going to take the soul of this HOA and reduce it to ashes. Victoria, Rachel interjected, you can't just seize private property and burn it down. That's illegal on so many levels. Dr. Santos, Victoria cut her off. This is between the association and Mr. Cooper. The council has no jurisdiction here. Actually, Rachel countered, as a council member, I have every right to question potential arson in our district. Victoria's smile tightened. We have all the necessary paperwork. The property was officially transferred to the HOA's ownership last week. When I said I was going to reduce this HOA to ashes, I wasn't speaking figuratively. As Victoria continued talking, as if she were lecturing me on the rules of coexistence, my mind was already working. Tactics, planning, execution. This wasn't just revenge. This was justice. I wasn't just going to accept what they had done to my property. I was going to make sure that the HOA never had the power to do that to anyone again. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. Victoria was still standing there, waiting for me to explode or beg for something, but I just shook my head and, without saying a word, walked straight to what was left of my house. She stood still for a second, not knowing if she had won or if something much worse was about to happen. Guess what? It was the second option. As I headed toward the house, Rachel followed me. She waited until we were out of Victoria's earshot before speaking. Mason, I need to tell you something. This isn't just about your property. Victoria's husband, Edward Harrington, is developing a luxury resort just outside town. They need access to the creek that runs through your property for their water features. I stopped in my tracks. My creek? The one my grandfather dammed to create that fishing pond. Rachel nodded grimly. It's the only year-round water source in this part of the county. They've been looking for ways to get control of it for months. I tried to warn you, but I was deployed. I finished the pieces falling into place. This wasn't just about HOA regulations. This was a calculated land grab. The first thing I did when I entered the house was to get my emergency safe. Nothing much, just a small steel safe that held important documents, a little money, and something even more valuable, evidence. Every piece of correspondence that the HOA had ever sent me. From the first warning about the unkempt appearance of my property to the final letter saying that my land had been legally acquired by them. Each of these letters was signed by the same person, that arrogant woman who had just burned down my farm. I opened a thicker envelope that came months ago. I read again the ridiculous clause that said that any property in the HOA area could be acquired if it was considered a security risk. And guess what? Who decided what was a security risk? The HOA itself. It's the equivalent of a fox writing the rules to protect the henhouse. I closed the safe and left. I already knew enough. Now I needed to understand how legally they thought they could get away with it. I've got contacts at the Riverside Chronicle, Rachel offered as we walked back outside. Emily Chun. She's an investigative reporter who's been looking into predatory HOAs across the state. This could be exactly the kind of story she needs. My first stop was the town hall. If there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's that bureaucracy can be both your greatest enemy and your best weapon. I entered the building with my HOA cards in hand and went straight to the property records section. The clerk looked at me like I was just another dumb farmer who couldn't read a contract. But then I threw a pile of papers on his desk and asked, I want to see the document that proves that this property was legally sold to the HOA. The guy blinked a few times, then picked up the papers and started searching the system. 5 minutes later, he looked up and said, There's no record of the sale here. I smiled. Then tell me how the hell they claim ownership over my farm. The guy kept typing, scratched his head, then finally found something. It looks like it was done through an eminent domain request within HOA guidelines. Now it made sense. They basically made up an excuse, called my farm a danger to the community, and claimed the land for themselves. But there's an important detail about eminent domain. It needs to be approved by the local government. And the only signature on that document? It was from the HOA itself. No judge, no city commission, no public hearing. Just them deciding among themselves that they could steal my land. As I was leaving the town hall, a slender Asian woman with a press badge approached me. Mr. Cooper, I'm Emily Chun from the Riverside Chronicle. Dr. Santos called me about your situation. I'd like to hear your side of the story. I studied her for a moment. She had sharp eyes and the kind of determined look I recognized from my more tenacious squad leaders in the Army. Someone who wouldn't back down easily. You think this is worth covering? I asked. Mr. Cooper, I've been investigating Victoria Harrington and her husband for months. Your farm isn't the first property they've seized, but it might be the most blatant example. If you're willing to go on record, we could blow this wide open. I thanked the city clerk and left. Now I knew how to bring him down. I went back to the farm and started organizing the evidence. I threw everything on the table, sat down, and started planning. I needed to expose this HOA for what it really was, a bunch of suburban tyrants who think they can do whatever they want without consequences. So I did 3 things. I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but one who specialized in property fraud and abuse of HOAs. A guy who was always trashing these associations in court. I talked to the neighbors. Not everyone in the HOA liked Victoria. A lot of people have been hurt before, but no one had the guts to stand up to her. Now, they had a leader, and I worked with Emily Chun to break the story wide open. Yes, I wanted the whole world to know. And not just any press. Emily had connections at national outlets that loved a scandal about corruption and abuse of power. The next day, while I waited for Emily's photographer to arrive, I sat on a balcony and stared at what was left of my property. The land was still mine. The fire had destroyed a lot, but the essence of the place was still there. And I was going to make sure it stayed that way. Rachel arrived with coffee and sandwiches. Thought you could use the sustenance, she said, setting the food down. How are you holding up? I'm fine, I said automatically, a response ingrained from my military days. She gave me a knowing look. Mason, I've known you since we were kids. You don't have to pretend with me. I sighed, accepting a cup of coffee. You know what eats at me the most? My grandfather's tools were in that barn. Hand-forged tools that survived 2 world wars. Things you can't replace. Rachel's hand found mine, squeezing gently. We'll make them pay for that, too. Then I heard the roar of an engine. I looked down the road and saw a black car approaching. This time it wasn't the HOA. It was someone they had sent, and now things are going to get really interesting. The black car stopped slowly on the dirt road, kicking up dust all around. It wasn't a car from anyone from the press. It was one of those pretentious, shiny sedans with dark windows and a driver who probably wore more perfume than scents. The door opened, and out stepped a man in a suit. Because of course there's always a man in a suit when the dirt starts to show. That's Edward Harrington, Rachel whispered. Victoria's husband and the CEO of Harrington Development. He rarely shows his face at these confrontations. He walked towards me with that gait of people who are used to bossing others around. As if his presence was enough to command respect. As if I were just another dumb farmer who couldn't read a contract and was now about to be explained how things work. I'd seen this kind of guy before. In the army, in meetings with superiors who wanted to push orders through without explanation. In the real estate market when they tried to buy this land from me years ago. In the government when they think they can dictate what you can and can't do with what's yours. He stopped a few paces away from me, straightened his tie as if that would change anything, and gave me a smile that smelled false from afar. Can we talk? He asked, purposely ignoring Rachel. I laughed, not because I thought it was funny, but because this guy's audacity amused me. Did he really think he could convince me with a smile and a few well-rehearsed words? It depends. I replied, are you responsible for setting fire to my farm? His smile faltered for a second. Of course not, but I represent the interests of the HOA, and we're willing to offer reasonable compensation to bring this matter to an amicable close. I looked at the wreckage of my barn, at the twisted fence, at the fire-scarred earth. Then I looked at him again. Let me get this straight. You want to pay me to pretend that none of this happened? He sighed as if he were dealing with a stubborn child. I want to offer you an advantageous solution. Lawsuits are expensive, time-consuming, and stressful. We can avoid all that. So that was it. They were scared. The HOA knew it had fucked up and wanted to sort it out before it blew up, before Emily published her story, before the community started questioning their power. I thought for a moment. I looked at him, then at the car, an expensive sedan with shiny wheels and a quiet engine. This guy had never picked up a hoe, never got his hands dirty, never built anything with his own effort. And now here he was, trying to negotiate the value of my dignity. Emily's car pulled up alongside Edward's, and I saw him stiffen as she got out with her photographer. Mr. Harrington, she called out, recorder already in hand. Emily Chun, Riverside Chronicle. Would you care to comment on the allegations that your development company has been using the HOA to seize properties for your new resort project? Edward's face hardened, his corporate mask slipping for just a moment to reveal raw anger beneath. This is a private conversation, he snapped. On a legally seized property, Emily countered smoothly. That makes it newsworthy. I crossed my arms. And how much do you think my farm is worth? He paused, assessing the situation, his eyes darting to Emily's recorder, and then said a number that was the most insulting thing I've ever heard in my life. I blinked, trying to understand if he really believed that was fair. The amount he offered wouldn't even pay for the damage to the tools burnt in the fire, let alone the rest of the farm. So I laughed again, this time out loud. He frowned, clearly uncomfortable. Something funny? You, I replied, thinking I'm stupid enough to accept it. His smile disappeared completely. That's a generous deal. You should consider it. I took a step forward, reducing the space between us. He was taller, but height means nothing when you're already dead inside. And me? I was ready. You burned my farm. You and your HOA stole what was mine. You think you can buy me off like I'm one of your office workers? I'm not that kind of man. I built this place with my hands. Do you think a piece of paper with a ridiculous number on it is going to make me forget everything you've done? Emily was scribbling notes frantically, and her photographer was capturing every moment of Edward's increasingly uncomfortable expression. He opened his mouth to say something, but I kept going. You want to avoid a lawsuit? Fine. But I'm not interested in your money. I'm interested in putting an end to all this shit. The guy took a deep breath, trying to keep his posture. If that's how you want to play it. I hope you have good lawyers. I have something better, I replied. The truth. His expression hardened. He already knew he'd lost this negotiation. Then, without saying another word, he turned his back, got into his car, and drove away. I stood there watching him disappear down the road, and then Emily approached me with a determined glint in her eye. That was gold, she said. Pure gold. Are you ready to do the interview now? Perfect. 10 minutes later, I was in front of the camera telling exactly what happened. How the HOA burned my farm. How they falsified documents to take possession of the land. How they destroyed years of work and history because of arbitrary rules invented to maintain control over the community. Then Rachel joined in, providing context as a council member about how the Harringtons had been systematically targeting properties along the creek for their resort development. But not everyone was happy with our crusade. As Emily conducted the interviews, a group of HOA members gathered at the edge of my property. Leading them was Charles Bentley, a retired banker who'd moved to our rural community 5 years ago and immediately started pushing for improvements that inevitably raised property values and HOA fees. You're hurting property values with this stunt, Cooper, he shouted. Some of us worked hard to build up this community's reputation. Some of us worked hard to build actual farms, Bentley. I shot back. The division was clear. Longtime residents who'd had their land for generations versus newcomers who wanted to transform our rural community into a suburban paradise with perfectly manicured lawns and rigid standards. I told them everything, and do you know what happened? The phone at the town hall exploded with calls. Neighbors started showing up wanting to talk about their own problems with the HOA. One said he'd been fined because he'd painted his garage door the wrong color. Another said he had to pay a fortune to redo his garden because the HOA thought it wasn't harmonious enough. And the best part? The police finally started moving, because when you set fire to private property, when you falsify documents, and when you try to buy someone's silence with a cheap bribe, that's not just arrogance. It's a crime. And I was ready to watch each and every one of them fall. But my fight wasn't universally supported. That night, Rachel called me in a panic. Mason, the town's divided. People are arguing in the grocery store, at church, everywhere. Bentley and his crowd are saying you're trying to destroy the community's future by going after the Harringtons. They're claiming the resort would bring jobs and revenue. And what do you think? I asked. There was a pause. I think maybe we should consider a compromise. If they offered fair compensation, and if they agreed to preserve part of the land. They burned my barn, Rachel. I cut her off, my voice hard. They destroyed my grandfather's tools. There's no compromise here. Understand, she said quietly. Just be careful, Mason. Victoria and Edward have a lot of power and a lot of friends. The day after the report, the HOA was already sinking in its own garbage. The city hall phone rang nonstop. The TV replayed the story every hour. And the neighbors who had previously kept quiet were now spitting out stories about years of abuse. Absurd fees and regulations invented to suck every penny out of those who lived in the area. Victoria was gone. The same one who thought she owned the world, who got out of her truck and treated me like I was a wild animal in her backyard. Now she was locked inside her house, ignoring journalists, neighbors, and even the other HOA members who were beginning to realize that she was a leaky boat and no one wanted to sink with her. But I wasn't finished yet, because exposing these people on TV was just the beginning. They had to pay literally. I took every piece of documentation I could find about the HOA's fraud, about the way they stole my farm, about the illegal fees they were charging the residents, and handed it all over to my lawyer. And not just any lawyer. This was one of those real sharks, a guy who didn't see lawsuits as a way to solve problems, but as a weapon to destroy enemies. By mid-afternoon, he had filed 3 different lawsuits against the HOA: trespassing, criminal destruction, and document fraud. And the best part? He wasn't alone. Other neighbors, motivated by the chaos I'd started, began filing lawsuits of their own, one for abusive charges, another for unlawful restraint, and a few more. Because apparently, this HOA was accumulating money from the neighborhood without being accountable to anyone, which brings me to the most beautiful part of the story, the audit. Emily's story hit the front page the next morning. Farmland firestorm. HOA burns veterans' property in luxury resort land grab. The online version included video of my confrontation with Edward Harrington, which quickly went viral. By noon, the state attorney general's office announced they were opening an investigation into the HOA's financial practices. That's when I received an unexpected visitor, Mayor Thomas Williams himself, accompanied by 2 police officers. "Mr. Cooper," he began formally, "I understand you've been through a terrible ordeal." I waited, suspicious of his sudden sympathy. "However," he continued, "I must ask you to cease your public campaign against the Harrington family and the Fairview HOA. Excuse me? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "The resort development is crucial to our town's economic future," he explained, not meeting my eyes. "Hundreds of jobs, millions in tax revenue. We can't afford to lose this opportunity." One of the officers shifted uncomfortably, clearly embarrassed by the mayor's naked corruption. "So, you want me to just forget they burned down my barn?" I asked incredulously. "The town is prepared to compensate you generously," the mayor offered quickly. "More than the Harringtons offered. A new barn, repairs to your house, even additional acreage elsewhere." I stood perfectly still, the way I'd been trained to do when scouting enemy positions. "And what about the law? The forged documents? The embezzlement?" The mayor forced a smile. "Administrative oversights. Nothing criminal. Get off my property," I said quietly. "Mr. Cooper, now," I roared, making all 3 men jump. "And when this is over, Mayor, you'll be answering questions under oath too." The police showed up with a warrant to investigate the HOA's finances, and that's when it got really fun. They discovered that Victoria and some other board members had been embezzling thousands of dollars from the association, pocketing ridiculous fees that they charged residents. Common area maintenance never done, security fees. The money went straight into their pockets. And with that came the collapse. The first to leave was the man in the suit, Edward Harrington, the one who tried to buy me off with reasonable compensation. The next day, he publicly resigned from the HOA board, saying that he had no idea what was going on behind the scenes of the HOA. A lie, of course, but nobody wanted to hear any excuses. The second was another board member who tried to sneak out when he saw that the police were starting to connect the dots. But Victoria? She held firm until the last minute. She locked the doors, pretended nothing was happening, ignored the journalists who had camped out in front of her house. Then came a bombshell. Investigators found a secret bank account in her name with money that had no explanation of where it came from. And it was at that very moment that everything fell apart. Emily called me one evening, her voice tight with excitement. "Mason, you need to come to the Chronicle office right now. I've received some documents you need to see." When I arrived, she spread a series of papers across her desk. These were sent anonymously. They're internal communications between Victoria, Edward, and Mayor Williams dating back 3 years. They've been planning this resort development since before the HOA even existed. I scanned the documents, my anger building with each page. They created the HOA specifically to take control of the properties along the creek. Emily nodded grimly. "And there's more. They knew about your military service. They specifically waited until you were deployed to move against your property." I felt cold rage wash over me. They targeted me because they thought I wouldn't be able to fight back. They targeted a lot of people, Emily said, but you were the first one who did. The TV cameras were there when the police knocked on the door of Victoria's house. Everyone in the neighborhood was watching as she came out in handcuffs with an expression of pure humiliation. What was left of the HOA collapsed. The association was officially dissolved after financial irregularities were confirmed. No leadership, no money, no power. And me? I went back to my farm, or what was left of it. Because yes, I won every penny of compensation, both from the HOA and from Victoria and the others involved. The judge had no mercy and ordered them to pay every dollar of the damage they had caused. 2 days after Victoria's arrest, Rachel stopped by with a bottle of whiskey. We sat on my porch, looking out at the burnt remains of my barn as the sun set. They offered Edward a plea deal, she said, pouring us each a drink. He's testifying against Victoria and the mayor. Says it was all their idea. I snorted. Of course he is. Mason, she hesitated. Some people in town are saying you went too far. That bringing down the resort project hurt the community. I sipped my whiskey slowly. What do you think? I think. She considered her words carefully. I think justice was necessary. But I also think we need to think about what comes next. This town still needs economic opportunities. Her words made me think. In my quest for justice, had I missed the bigger picture? Had my personal vendetta against the Harringtons and their corrupt HOA blinded me to the legitimate needs of the community? I used the money to rebuild everything better, bigger, stronger. Every piece of the fence was reinforced. Every structure was rebuilt with materials that wouldn't collapse so easily. The barn went up again, but this time I installed security cameras. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that people like this always come back to try and screw you over again. Only this time, I'd be ready. But I also did something unexpected. I approached the town council with a proposal, a smaller, more sustainable tourism project centered around the creek running through my property. Fishing, camping, local crafts, and agriculture education. Not every development has to destroy what makes this place special, I told them. We can build something that honors our rural heritage instead of erasing it. Emily wrote one final article about the project, featuring a photo of me standing in front of my rebuilt barn. The headline read, "From Ashes to Opportunity. Veteran rebuilds farm and community." What's left of the HOA? Nothing but a warning to anyone who might try something similar in the future. And every time I sit on the porch, sipping my coffee and looking at my restored land, I remember one thing. If they had simply left me alone, they would be living their lives normally to this day. But they chose to start a war. And I finished it. If you like this true story, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel.